As evening settles around you and the world grows quiet, let us journey together into the realm of extraordinary women who wore crowns not just upon their heads, but within their souls. Great queens who ruled empires, commanded armies, and shaped the destiny of nations in times when women were so often relegated to silence. Tonight, we drift through the corridors of time, where echoes of royal decrees still linger, where ancient thrones still hold the imprint of those who dared to claim power in a world designed to deny it to them. You need do nothing now but rest. Allow your breathing to slow and your thoughts to quieten as we travel back to lands and kingdoms where women of remarkable courage and intellect rose above the limitations of their time, each with her own story, each leaving her unique mark upon the tapestry of history. Tonight, we explore not simply their triumphs and tragedies, but the very essence of female sovereignty, how it was claimed, how it was wielded, and how it transformed the world around it. For centuries, the stories of these queens have been told and retold, sometimes diminished to mere footnotes in histories written by men, other times exaggerated into caricatures of feminine excess or weakness. But beneath the myths and legends lie the true women, complex, contradictory, and utterly human in their greatness. Queens who navigated treacherous courts, who negotiated peace between warring nations, who commissioned great works of art and architecture, who reformed laws and religions, who led their people through plague and famine and war. In the soft darkness of night, let us discover the queens whose wisdom still whispers to us across the centuries. Some you may know well, others may be new companions on this journey, but all have stories worth telling, worth hearing, worth remembering as you drift towards sleep. Long before written history, female leadership existed in human societies. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many early cultures, women held significant positions of power. But as civilizations grew more complex and warfare became more prevalent, leadership increasingly fell to men. Yet even then, extraordinary women found paths to power, sometimes through birthright, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through sheer force of will and intellect. In ancient Egypt, the concept of female rule was unusual, but not unheard of. The pharaoh was believed to be the living embodiment of the god Horus, inherently masculine in nature. And yet, Egypt saw several female pharaohs who transcended gender to claim divine authority. The most famous among them was Hatshepsut, who ruled not as queen, but as king of Upper and Lower Egypt for over 20 years during the 15th century BCE. Hatshepsut's path to power was not straightforward. Born a royal princess, she married her half-brother, Thutmose II, as was customary in the royal family, becoming his great royal wife. When he died, his son by a secondary wife was too young to rule, and Hatshepsut initially served as regent. But within a few years, she had taken the unprecedented step of claiming the full powers and titles of pharaoh for herself. In art and statuary, Hatshepsut was often depicted with the traditional false beard and masculine attire of a king. Yet in inscriptions, she was referred to with feminine pronouns. It was not that she wished to be seen as a man, but rather that the visual language of Egyptian kingship had no feminine equivalent. She adapted the symbols of power to her female identity, creating something entirely new in the process. Under Hatshepsut's rule, Egypt prospered. She established important trade routes, particularly with the land of Punt, bringing back gold ebony, ivory, and exotic animals and plants. She commissioned magnificent buildings, including her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, which still stands as a testament to her vision. She maintained peace and stability throughout her reign, allowing arts and culture to flourish. Yet after her death, there came an attempt to erase her from history. Her successor, Thutmose III, perhaps threatened by the precedent of female rule, ordered her name chiseled from monuments and her images destroyed. For thousands of years, her story was lost, her achievements attributed to the men who came before and after her. It was not until the 19th century that archaeologists began to uncover the truth of her extraordinary reign. Across the ancient world, other queens left their mark. In Mesopotamia, Kubaba became the only queen on the Sumerian king list, ruling the city-state of Kish around 2300 BCE. Though little is known of her reign, her very presence on this list speaks to her exceptional status. She was remembered not as a consort, but as a ruler in her own right, in a society where kingship was typically male. The Assyrian queen, Sammu Rammat, who ruled as regent for her son in the 9th century BCE, became so legendary that she inspired the Greek myths of Semiramis, a queen credited with founding Babylon and conquering much of Asia. While the Greek tales were largely fictional, they grew from the seed of a real woman whose power was remarkable enough to echo through centuries. Further east, the Indian subcontinent saw the rise of powerful queens, particularly in southern regions where gender norms were sometimes less restrictive. Queen Naganika of the Satavahana dynasty ruled parts of central India in the 1st century BCE, issuing coins in her own name and making significant donations to Buddhist monuments, ensuring her legacy would endure in stone and metal. In ancient China, the path to female rule was particularly difficult within the strict Confucian hierarchy. Yet Wu Zetian managed what seemed impossible, becoming the only woman in over 4,000 years of Chinese history to assume the title of emperor rather than empress. Her journey began as a low-ranking concubine in the Tang court, but her intelligence and political acumen saw her rise to become the trusted consort of Emperor Gaozong. When Gaozong suffered a debilitating stroke, Wu Zetian began to administer state affairs on his behalf. After his death, she outmaneuvered her own sons to take direct control of the imperial court, eventually establishing her own Zhou dynasty. Her 50-year period of influence saw significant reforms in agriculture, taxation, and education. She elevated the status of Buddhism, expanded China's territories, and instituted a meritocratic system of government that chose officials based on skill rather than family connections. Wu Zetian's methods were often ruthless. She eliminated rivals without mercy and maintained extensive networks of spies. Traditional historians, writing with Confucian biases, portrayed her as a monster of depravity and cruelty. Yet modern scholars recognize her as a capable ruler whose policies strengthened China and improved the lives of common people. The complexity of her character, both visionary and vengeful, both reformer and tyrant, reminds us that great rulers are rarely simple in their virtues or their flaws. In the ancient Mediterranean, Cleopatra, the 7th Philopator, last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, wielded power with a subtle hand. Though often remembered primarily for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Cleopatra was a formidable political strategist who spoke 9 languages and was educated in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and oratory. Unlike her Ptolemaic predecessors, she learned the Egyptian language, presenting herself to her subjects as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. Cleopatra inherited a kingdom in decline, threatened by the expanding Roman Republic and beset by internal problems, including famine and economic instability. Her alliances with Caesar and later Antony were not merely romantic entanglements, but calculated political moves intended to preserve Egypt's independence and restore its former power. Through these relationships, she secured her throne against rival claimants and expanded her territories. The Roman propaganda that followed her defeat and suicide painted Cleopatra as a seductress who used feminine wiles to corrupt virtuous Roman men. Yet this narrative obscures the reality of a queen fighting desperately to maintain her nation's sovereignty against an imperialist power. In death, as in life, Cleopatra's image was shaped by those who feared the power she represented, the power of a woman who refused to be conquered. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, new queens emerged across Europe, Asia, and Africa, each navigating the specific constraints and opportunities of her culture. In Byzantium, the Empress Theodora rose from humble origins as a dancer and actress, professions often associated with prostitution in her time, to become the most powerful woman in the Byzantine Empire. Her marriage to Justinian elevated her to the imperial throne, but it was her own courage and conviction that cemented her place in history. During the Nika riots of 532 CE, when angry citizens threatened to depose Justinian, it was Theodora who convinced her husband to stand firm rather than flee. "Purple makes a fine shroud," she allegedly declared, preferring to die as an empress than to live as a fugitive. Her resolve saved the throne and allowed Justinian to implement significant legal reforms, many of which improved the status of women. Theodora established houses for reformed prostitutes, changed divorce laws to benefit women, and instituted the death penalty for rape. Across the Islamic world, queens and sultanas exercised power in various ways. Shajar al-Dur began as a slave concubine, but rose to become the Sultana of Egypt in 1250 after her husband's death during the Seventh Crusade, although her direct rule lasted only 80 days before she was forced to marry and nominally share power. She continued to exert significant influence through the newly established Mamluk dynasty. In medieval Europe, the concept of queenship evolved within the frameworks of Christianity and feudalism. Queens were expected to be pious, fertile, and supportive of their kingly husbands, yet many transcended these limitations to wield substantial authority. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived from approximately 1122 to 1204, embodied this complexity. Heiress to the wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, she first married Louis VII of France. When that marriage was annulled after 15 years, she immediately married Henry of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. Eleanor was not merely a consort, but a ruler in her own right over her ancestral lands in southern France. She established a court at Poitiers that became a center for troubadour poetry and courtly love, influencing the cultural development of Western Europe. When her sons rebelled against their father, she supported them, leading Henry to imprison her for 16 years. Yet upon his death, she re-emerged as a vital political figure, securing the throne for her son Richard I and serving as regent while he was away on crusade. In her later years, Eleanor traveled across the Pyrenees in the depth of winter at nearly 80 years old to select and escort her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, to marry the French heir. She outlived most of her children and shaped the political landscape of Europe through 3 generations. Eleanor's longevity, resilience, and political acumen made her one of the most influential women of the medieval period. The Spanish queen, Isabella of Castile, who ruled from 1474 to 1504, transformed her country through strategic marriage and military leadership. By marrying Ferdinand of Aragon, she laid the groundwork for the unification of Spain. Together, they completed the Reconquista, ending nearly 800 years of Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula with the conquest of Granada in 1492. That same year, Isabella made the fateful decision to finance Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, unwittingly initiating the Spanish colonial empire in the Americas. Isabella was deeply religious, establishing the Spanish Inquisition and expelling Jews and Muslims who refused to convert to Christianity. These actions, viewed as grave injustices today, were seen in her time as expressions of her pious nature. She was also a patron of arts and education, founding the University of Alcalá de Henares and amassing an impressive personal library at a time when books were rare and precious. In England, the Tudor era saw the rise of queens who ruled in their own right, rather than as consorts or regents. The most notable was Elizabeth I, who came to the throne in 1558 after the tumultuous reigns of her brother Edward VI and sister Mary I. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by religious strife, threatened by more powerful neighbors, and economically unstable. For a woman expected to marry and produce an heir, Elizabeth made the remarkable choice to remain single, famously declaring herself married to England. This decision was both personal and political, allowing her to maintain independence and avoid the foreign entanglements that would come with a royal husband. She skillfully played potential suitors against each other for diplomatic advantage, earning the nickname the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's 45-year reign became known as a golden age for England. She stabilized the Anglican Church, defeated the Spanish Armada, and presided over a flourishing of English culture that included the works of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Her careful balance of firmness and clemency in dealing with threats to her rule showed political wisdom, though she could be ruthless when necessary, as in her eventual execution of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth understood the power of image and carefully crafted her public persona. Portraits depicted her as eternally youthful, bejeweled, and magnificent, standing on maps of England or holding symbolic objects like sieves, representing virginity, or rainbows, representing peace. Her speeches, like the famous address to the troops at Tilbury, where she claimed to have the heart and stomach of a king, consciously blended feminine and masculine qualities to create a new kind of sovereign authority. As we drift across the Channel to France, we encounter Catherine de' Medici, who never ruled in her own name, but exercised enormous influence as queen consort and then queen mother. Born into the wealthy Italian Medici family, Catherine married the future King Henry II of France in 1533. For the first decade of her marriage, she was overshadowed by her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and faced pressure due to her inability to produce an heir. When she finally began bearing children, she ultimately gave birth to 10, 7 of whom survived infancy. After Henry's death in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine emerged as a dominant political figure, serving as regent for her young sons and continuing to exert influence even after they came of age. She governed during one of France's most turbulent periods, as the wars of religion between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, tore the country apart. Catherine's primary goal was to preserve the French monarchy and the power of her sons. She attempted various strategies to create peace, including arranging the marriage of her Catholic daughter Marguerite to the Protestant Henry of Navarre. But she is perhaps best remembered for her alleged role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which thousands of Huguenots were killed in Paris and throughout France. While historians debate her level of responsibility for the scale of the violence, this event permanently darkened her reputation. Yet Catherine was also a significant patron of the arts, architecture, and science. She brought Italian Renaissance culture to the French court, built the Tuileries Palace, expanded the Royal Library, and supported astronomers and other scholars. She introduced ballet to the French court as a form of political entertainment. The complex banquets and spectacles she arranged were not merely extravagant displays, but carefully orchestrated political events designed to enhance royal prestige. Across the vast steppes of Central Asia, one woman created the largest contiguous land empire in history. Though not technically a queen, Berta Eugène, the first and chief wife of Genghis Khan, wielded tremendous influence. After her husband's death, she and her sons ruled the Mongol Empire, with her eldest son, Ogedei, officially succeeding as Khan. The respect accorded to her within the fiercely patriarchal Mongol society stemmed from her wisdom, resilience, and political acumen. When captured by a rival tribe early in her marriage, she demonstrated the mental fortitude that would later help her guide an empire, surviving and returning to her husband's side to become his most trusted advisor. In Russia, 2 extraordinary empresses dominated the 18th century. The first, Catherine I, began life as Martha Skavronskaya, a peasant girl from territories that are now part of Latvia. Orphaned at an early age and raised by a Lutheran pastor, she was working as a servant when Russian forces captured her during the Great Northern War. She eventually caught the eye of Peter the Great, becoming first his mistress and then his wife. Peter came to rely heavily on Catherine, who accompanied him on military campaigns and served as his confidant in matters of state. When he died without naming an heir in 1725, the imperial guards supported Catherine's claim to the throne, making her the first woman to rule Russia as empress in her own right. Though her reign lasted only 2 years before her death, she established the precedent for female rule that would be followed by several other empresses in the 18th century. The most significant of these was Catherine II, later known as Catherine the Great. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in Prussia, she was brought to Russia at 14 to marry the heir to the throne, the future Peter III. The marriage was unhappy, but Catherine adapted brilliantly to her new country, learning the Russian language and converting to the Orthodox faith. She cultivated allies among the noble guards regiments and the influential aristocratic families. When Peter III became emperor in 1762, his pro-Prussian policies and his plans to secularize church lands alienated many powerful groups. After just 6 months on the throne, he was overthrown in a coup that brought Catherine to power. Although she had not actively planned the coup, she quickly took advantage of the situation, riding through the streets of St. Petersburg in a guard's uniform to rally support. Over her 34-year reign, Catherine presided over the expansion of the Russian Empire and its emergence as a major European power. She annexed Crimea, partitioned Poland, and colonized Alaska. Domestically, she implemented administrative reforms, established the first state-funded institution of higher education for women, and became one of Europe's greatest patrons of the arts. Her correspondence with Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers earned her a reputation as an enlightened despot, though in practice, her reforms often benefited the nobility more than the serfs, whose conditions worsened under her rule. Catherine's personal life generated much gossip, both during her lifetime and after. She took a series of lovers, many much younger than herself, granting them significant gifts and positions. Yet these relationships were not merely romantic. They also served political purposes, allowing Catherine to create a circle of loyal supporters outside the traditional power structures. Her unflinching recognition that a female ruler would be judged differently than a male led her to control her own narrative, commissioning portraits that emphasized her wisdom and strength rather than conventional feminine attributes. In 18th century Austria, Maria Theresa became the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions, reigning from 1740 to 1780. Her father, Charles VI, had spent his reign securing acceptance for the Pragmatic Sanction, which allowed for female inheritance of the Habsburg lands. Yet when he died, leaving 23-year-old Maria Theresa as his heir, Prussia, Bavaria, and France promptly disregarded the sanction and invaded her territories, beginning the War of the Austrian Succession. Faced with this existential threat, the young queen traveled to Hungary to appeal directly to the Hungarian nobility for support. Tradition holds that she appeared before the Diet of Hungary carrying her infant son, moving the nobles to cry out, "Vitam et sanguinem pro regina nostra," our lives and blood for our queen. Whether or not this dramatic scene occurred exactly as described, Maria Theresa did secure vital Hungarian support that helped her maintain her throne. Once her position was secure, Maria Theresa proved to be a reforming monarch who strengthened the central government, reorganized the army, improved tax collection, and established universal primary education. Though personally devout and conservative, she implemented pragmatic policies that modernized the Habsburg state. She also gave birth to 16 children, including the future Queen Marie Antoinette of France and 2 Holy Roman Emperors. The story of Marie Antoinette offers a stark contrast to her mother's success. Married at 14 to the future Louis XVI of France, the Austrian Archduchess found herself in the glittering but treacherous court of Versailles. Initially popular, she soon became a target for gossip and political attacks. Her perceived extravagance, though often exaggerated, and her foreign birth made her a convenient scapegoat for France's mounting economic and social problems. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Marie Antoinette's position became increasingly precarious. Unlike her politically adept mother, she was unable to navigate the rapidly changing situation. After a failed attempt to flee Paris in 1791, the royal family was effectively imprisoned. Following the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette herself was tried on charges ranging from treason to sexual abuse of her son, a fabricated accusation. She went to the guillotine in October 1793, maintaining her dignity to the end. The tragic fall of Marie Antoinette demonstrates how queenship, for all its privileges, could also be profoundly vulnerable. Queens were expected to embody contradictory ideals: to be fertile yet pure, magnificent yet modest, influential yet submissive. When they failed to balance these impossible demands, or when political winds shifted against them, the consequences could be severe. Across the English Channel, another queen faced challenges of a different nature. Queen Victoria ascended the British throne in 1837 at the age of 18, following a succession of elderly uncles whose excesses had damaged the monarchy's reputation. Her 63-year reign, the longest in British history until recently surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II, saw Britain reach the height of its imperial and industrial power. Victoria's early years as queen were shaped by her relationship with her first prime minister, Lord Melbourne, who became her trusted mentor. Her marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840 brought her personal happiness and a valuable political partner. Together, they raised 9 children who would marry into royal families across Europe, earning Victoria the nickname Grandmother of Europe. After Albert's premature death in 1861, Victoria retreated into prolonged mourning, wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her life. Though she initially neglected her public duties, leading to Republican sentiment, she gradually re-emerged as a symbol of British stability and imperial might. The Widow of Windsor became a powerful emblem of domestic virtue, even as she presided over an expanding empire that covered nearly a quarter of the globe. Victoria's reign was marked by dramatic social, political, and technological changes. Britain transformed from a primarily agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. The franchise was gradually extended, though Victoria herself opposed women's suffrage. Colonial territories were added across Africa and Asia, often through violent conquest, justified by racist ideologies that Victoria largely accepted. The queen who gave her name to an era embraced some forms of progress while resisting others, embodying both the achievements and the contradictions of 19th century Britain. In the vast Indian subcontinent, which became the jewel in the crown of Victoria's empire, other queens fought to preserve their sovereignty against British encroachment. Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi, became one of the leading figures of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the First War of Indian Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. Born into a Brahmin family and given an unusual education that included horsemanship and martial arts, she married the Raja of Jhansi and adopted a son with him to continue the royal line. When the Raja died, the British East India Company applied the doctrine of lapse, which allowed them to annex states with no natural heir, refusing to recognize the adopted son. The Rani was granted a pension and expected to relinquish power quietly. Instead, when the rebellion broke out, she raised an army including a women's regiment, and fought against the British forces. She died in battle in June 1858, wearing men's clothing and fighting with extraordinary courage. Even her British opponents admired her bravery, with one major describing her as the bravest and best military leader of the rebels. The story of the Rani of Jhansi illustrates how queens outside Europe often had to be warriors as well as rulers, directly leading troops into battle. Similarly, Queen Ya Asantewa of the Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana led her people against British colonial forces in the War of the Golden Stool in 1900. When male leaders hesitated to challenge British demands, the 60-year-old Queen Mother declared, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." Though ultimately defeated and exiled, her courage inspired future generations in the struggle for independence. In the quieter reaches of the European continent, another queen was shaping her nation's destiny through intellectual rather than military leadership. Queen Sophia of Sweden, born a German princess, married Oscar II in 1872 and became queen 5 years later. Though living in an era when royal women were expected to focus on family and charitable works, Sophia established the nursing profession in Sweden, personally funding and organizing the Sophia Home for nurse training. Her interest in healthcare stemmed partly from her own chronic health issues, but grew into a mission to transform Swedish medical care. Sophia also supported women's rights and education, working quietly behind the scenes due to the constitutional limitations on royal political activity. Her religious devotion led her to support evangelical missions, sometimes creating tension with the Lutheran state church. Though never wielding direct political power, she exemplified how queens could affect significant social change through strategic philanthropy and by lending royal prestige to reform movements. If we turn our attention back to England, we find Queen Alexandra, the Danish princess who married Edward VII. During her long tenure as Princess of Wales, from 1863 to 1901, she endured her husband's numerous infidelities with dignity while building her own sphere of influence. Despite developing significant hearing loss and a limp caused by rheumatic fever, she remained a fashion icon whose style was copied throughout Europe and America. Alexandra used her popularity to advance causes she cared about, particularly children's health and welfare. Her visit to a London hospital during a diphtheria outbreak, when others feared contagion, helped destigmatize the disease and focus attention on improving sanitary conditions. As queen from 1901 to 1910, she continued this philanthropic work while serving as a moderating influence on her sometimes impulsive husband. The paths to queenship were varied, as we have seen. Some women were born to royal destiny, others married into it, and a few seized it through their own determination. But almost all successful queens shared certain qualities: political astuteness, the ability to build networks of support, and a keen understanding of how to use the limited tools available to them. Many learned to work within the constraints of their societies while subtly expanding the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Queens often exercise power differently than kings. Without the option of military leadership in many cultures, they frequently relied on diplomatic skill, strategic marriages for their children, patronage networks, and careful image management. They built monuments not just in stone, but in legal codes, educational institutions, and cultural patterns that sometimes outlasted more material tributes. The personal cost of queenship could be immense. Royal women were expected to produce heirs, preferably male, often from a very young age. Many died in childbirth. Their marriages were arranged for political advantage rather than personal compatibility, though some developed genuine partnerships with their husbands. Their children were raised according to royal protocol, sometimes limiting maternal influence, and they faced constant scrutiny with their physical appearance, behavior, and associations all subject to public comment and criticism. Yet despite these constraints, queens throughout history found ways to leave distinctive marks on their realms. Some, like Isabella of Castile, expanded territories through conquest and exploration. Others, like Maria Theresa, modernized administration and education. Still others, like Catherine de' Medici, preserved dynasties through periods of crisis. Their strategies and priorities differed, shaped by their unique personalities as well as the specific challenges of their times and places. As night deepens around you and sleep draws nearer, consider how these royal women navigated worlds designed for male rule. Consider how they transformed limitations into opportunities, how they used the very expectations that constrain them, of piety, of motherhood, of beauty, as sources of authority and influence. Consider how, in writing their own stories, they changed what was possible for the women who came after them. The queens of history were not perfect. Many upheld unjust systems that privileged the few over the many. Some participated in religious persecution, colonial expansion, or the suppression of popular movements. They were products of their times, even as they sometimes transcended those times. Their legacies are complex, worthy of neither uncritical celebration nor simplistic condemnation, but of thoughtful understanding. In their struggles and triumphs, in their public glories and private sorrows, these queens remind us of the enduring human desire to shape the world rather than merely be shaped by it. They remind us that power takes many forms, that leadership can wear many faces, that the crown, whether literal or metaphorical, transforms the wearer, even as the wearer transforms what the crown itself means. As you drift toward sleep, imagine these queens in their palaces and council chambers, in their moments of decision and reflection. Imagine Hatshepsut commissioning her great temple, Elizabeth addressing her troops, Catherine studying reports from the distant corners of her empire. Imagine them not as remote historical figures, but as women of flesh and blood, ambition and doubt, conviction and compromise, women who change the course of nations through the force of their will and the strength of their vision. The stories of these remarkable women continue to inspire and instruct us. They speak of resilience in the face of adversity, of intelligence finding its expression despite obstacles, of the different ways power can be wielded effectively. They remind us that leadership is not defined by gender, but by capacity, that influence flows not just from formal authority, but from character and commitment. In West Africa, Queen Amina of Zazzau emerged as a military and commercial leader who expanded her kingdom's borders and established trade routes that would last for centuries. Born around 1533 in what is now northern Nigeria, Amina was the daughter of Queen Bakwa Turunku, who herself had built the capital city of Zazau. From an early age, Amina showed an interest in martial skills, training with the warriors of the kingdom. When she ascended to the throne at age 35, following her brother's reign, she immediately embarked on a series of military campaigns. For 34 years, she led her cavalry in person, conquering territories until Zazau encompassed much of the region that would later become northern Nigeria. Under her rule, the kingdom built fortified walls around its cities, many of which still stand today, known as Amina's Walls. Amina never married and never bore children, choosing instead to take temporary consorts from among the men defeated in battle. This unconventional personal life allowed her to avoid the complications of dynastic politics and maintain undisputed control over her expanding realm. Her focus remained on strengthening her kingdom through conquest, trade, and infrastructure development. The story of Queen Amina reminds us that women's leadership in Africa was not merely ceremonial, but often directly martial, with queens commanding armies and personally leading troops into battle. This tradition continued with figures like Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who resisted Portuguese colonization in what is now Angola during the 17th century. Born into the royal family around 1583, Nzinga, sometimes spelled Njinga, was sent by her brother, the king, to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in 1622. According to legend, when the governor provided her with no chair, expecting her to sit on the floor in a position of inferiority, Nzinga signaled to one of her attendants, who knelt on all fours to create a human chair. After completing the negotiations as an equal, she left without releasing her attendant from service, a powerful symbolic statement about refusing to accept subordinate status. When her brother died, Nzinga took control of the kingdom, initially converting to Christianity to strengthen her position. However, as Portuguese slave raiding intensified, she led her people in resistance, forming alliances with local powers and even the Dutch. When forced to flee her homeland, she established herself as Queen of Matamba, creating a haven for escaped slaves and building a formidable military that included female soldiers. For nearly 40 years, Nzinga fought against Portuguese colonization through a combination of military action, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. Though she could not ultimately prevent Portuguese encroachment, her resistance delayed the colonization process and preserved independence far longer than would otherwise have been possible. Her tactical flexibility, sometimes fighting, sometimes negotiating, sometimes retreating to create new power centers, demonstrated remarkable political intelligence. Across the Atlantic, in the highland valleys of South America, women of royal Inca lineage navigated the tumultuous period of Spanish conquest with their own forms of resistance. Nusta Cuxirimay, Oclo, an Inca princess born to Emperor Huayna Capac, was given in marriage to the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro after the fall of the Inca Empire. Baptized as Doña Angelina, she outwardly adapted to Spanish customs while secretly maintaining her cultural identity. Though not officially a queen, Doña Angelina used her position to protect fellow indigenous people and preserve Inca knowledge and traditions during a time of violent cultural suppression. After Pizarro's assassination, she married another Spaniard, continuing to use her connections to the colonial elite to mitigate some of the worst abuses against her people. Her daughter became one of the first mestiza women to document the history of the Inca from an insider's perspective. This pattern of indigenous royal women using strategic marriages, cultural adaptability, and behind-the-scenes influence to protect their communities was repeated across the Americas. The Mesoamerican noblewoman, known as La Malinche, or Doña Marina, after her baptism, served as translator and advisor to Hernán Cortés during the conquest of the Aztec Empire. While some view her as a traitor, others see a woman making difficult choices to survive and potentially moderate the violence of conquest. In what is now the southeastern United States, a Choctaw chieftainess named Hopahan led her people in the early 19th century, negotiating with American authorities to preserve as much Choctaw sovereignty as possible in the face of relentless territorial expansion. Though her power was not formalized in ways recognized by European political systems, she functioned as a queen in all but name, making decisions that affected the survival and well-being of thousands. Further north, in the eastern woodlands, women of the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Confederacy held significant political power through the Council of Clan Mothers. While not queens in the European sense, these women selected and removed male chiefs, controlled the distribution of resources, and had veto power over decisions of war and peace. Some scholars believe this system of female political participation influenced early American feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage, who lived near Haudenosaunee territories and observed their governance. Returning to Africa, the 19th century saw the rise of another warrior queen in present-day Ghana. Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of Ejisu in the Ashanti Empire, led the final war of resistance against British colonialism in the year 1900. When the British governor demanded the sacred golden stool, symbol of Ashanti national identity, Ya Asantewa took command of the resistance. At a meeting where male leaders hesitated to challenge British power, she declared, "If you men will not go forward, then we will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men until the last of us falls in the battlefields." Taking up arms at the age of 60, she mobilized an army that besieged the British fort at Kumasi for several months before superior colonial firepower eventually prevailed. Though defeated and sent into exile, where she died in 1921, Ya Asantewa became a powerful symbol of African resistance to colonialism. Her courage challenged not only imperial power, but also gender expectations, demonstrating that elderly women could lead military resistance when circumstances required. Her legacy inspired later independence movements across Africa, particularly in Ghana, which became the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve independence in 1957. In Vietnam, the Trung sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, led one of the earliest recorded resistance movements against Chinese imperial domination in the year 40 CE. Daughters of a Vietnamese lord, they took up arms after Trung Trac's husband was executed by Chinese authorities for resistance activities. Gathering an army that included many female officers, they drove out the Chinese occupiers and established an independent state with Trung Trac as queen. Though their rule lasted only 3 years before the Chinese reasserted control, the Trung sisters established a powerful precedent of female military leadership that would resurface throughout Vietnamese history. They are still celebrated as national heroes in Vietnam, with temples dedicated to their memory and a holiday commemorating their uprising. Across East Asia, women periodically wielded significant power despite Confucian ideologies that generally limited female authority. In Japan, Empress Suiko became the first of several female emperors when she ascended the throne in 592 CE. During her 35-year reign, she oversaw the official introduction of Buddhism to Japan, commissioned the country's first historical chronicles, and implemented a new 12-level cap rank system for court officials based on the Chinese model. Working closely with her nephew, Prince Shotoku, Empress Suiko helped transform Japan from a tribal confederation into a centralized state with elaborate court rituals and a written legal code. Though later Japanese historians sometimes diminished her role, portraying her as merely a figurehead for male relatives, contemporary records suggest she exercised real authority, receiving foreign ambassadors and issuing edicts in her own name. Several other women would rule Japan as empresses regnant over the centuries, including Empress Genmai, who established the capital at Nara, and Empress Go Sakuramachi, the last female emperor who ruled in the 18th century. These women navigated complex court politics and religious obligations while maintaining imperial authority in a system that increasingly restricted women's public roles. In Korea, Queen Seondeok ruled the Kingdom of Silla from 632 to 647 CE, becoming the first female sovereign in Korean history. A member of the royal Seondeok clan, she inherited the throne when the male line of succession failed. During her reign, she strengthened ties with Tang China, encouraged the spread of Buddhism, and commissioned the building of Cheomseongdae, one of the world's oldest surviving astronomical observatories. Queen Seondeok was known for her prophecies and political acumen, though she faced multiple rebellions from nobles who opposed female rule. After her death, she was succeeded by her cousin, Queen Jindeok, creating a rare period of consecutive female leadership in ancient Korea. Their successful reigns helped cement the position of the Seondeok clan and contributed to Silla's eventual unification of the Korean peninsula. Several centuries later, another Korean queen would face far more tragic circumstances. Queen Min, also known as Empress Myeongsong, was the wife of King Gojong of the Joseon dynasty in the late 19th century. Intelligent and politically astute, she effectively governed the country as her husband showed little interest in politics. She advocated for reform and modernization while trying to maintain Korean independence in the face of increasing Japanese influence. Queen Min's diplomatic strategy involved balancing various foreign powers, Russia, China, Japan, and Western nations, against each other to prevent any single country from dominating Korea. This approach earned her the enmity of the Japanese, who saw her as the primary obstacle to their colonial ambitions. In 1895, Japanese agents broke into the royal palace and assassinated her, an act of state-sponsored terrorism that shocked the international community. Though her life ended in violence, Queen Min left a legacy of nationalist resistance and modernization efforts that would inspire later generations of Koreans. Her story illuminates the particular dangers faced by queens who opposed imperial expansion during the age of colonialism, when traditional diplomatic tools proved inadequate against industrial military power. Southeast Asia produced several other notable queens who navigated similar pressures of modernization and colonial threat. In Cambodia, Queen Ong May ruled from 1835 to 1841 as the last sovereign monarch before the establishment of the French Protectorate, ascending to the throne at age 15 after her father's death. She struggled to preserve Cambodian independence against encroachment from both Vietnam and Siam, Thailand. Though ultimately unsuccessful in preventing foreign interference, Queen Ong May is remembered for her efforts to maintain Cambodia's cultural and political identity during a period of severe external pressure. She built temples, supported the Buddhist Sangha, monastic community, and tried to implement administrative reforms that would strengthen the central government. Her reign marked the last period of full Cambodian sovereignty until the mid-20th century. In Thailand, while women were formally excluded from the monarchy, royal women occasionally exercised significant power as regents or behind-the-scenes advisors. Queen Suryothai, who died in battle against Burmese invaders in 1548, became a symbol of Thai patriotism and self-sacrifice. Riding into battle on a war elephant alongside her husband, she deliberately positioned herself between the king and an attacking Burmese prince, receiving a fatal blow meant for her husband. More recently, Queen Saovabha Bongsri served as regent of Siam during the early 20th century, while her son, King Vajiravud, completed his education abroad. During her regency, she continued the modernization policies begun by her husband, King Chulalongkorn, and strengthened diplomatic ties with European powers to maintain Siam's independence. She established the Thai Red Cross Society and supported education for women at a time when female literacy was still uncommon. The pattern of queens serving as modernizers and cultural bridges appears repeatedly across different societies. These women often received more cosmopolitan educations than their male counterparts, sometimes due to foreign marriages that exposed them to different traditions and governance systems. Their outsider perspective, combined with deep commitment to their adoptive homes, frequently made them effective agents of selective modernization, adopting useful innovations while preserving core cultural values. This was certainly true of Queen Emma of Hawaii, born in 1836 to a Hawaiian chieftainess and a British settler. Marrying King Kamehameha IV in 1856, she worked alongside him to establish a public hospital system and improve education. After her husband's death and the subsequent death of their only child, she established schools and churches in their memory. When the Hawaiian throne became vacant in 1873, Queen Emma ran for the position in an election held among nobles and representatives, the monarchy having become constitutional. Though she lost to David Kalakaua, she continued her philanthropic work and became a symbol of resistance to American influence. She supported the preservation of traditional Hawaiian culture, collecting chants and genealogies at a time when indigenous practices were being displaced by Western ones. Queen Emma's contemporary, Queen Liliuokalani, would become Hawaii's last monarch, deposed by American business interests in 1893 when she attempted to promulgate a new constitution restoring power to the Hawaiian monarchy and native Hawaiians. During her imprisonment following the coup, she composed songs including the famous Aloha Oe, which became an unofficial anthem expressing love for the lost kingdom. Though unable to prevent annexation by the United States, Liliuokalani established a trust to care for orphaned and indigent Hawaiian children that continues to operate today. The queens of the Pacific Islands, like many others we have encountered, demonstrate remarkable adaptability in the face of rapid cultural and political change. They often served as living bridges between traditional ways and modernizing influences, seeking paths that would allow their people to adapt without being completely subsumed by foreign powers. In the Middle East, female rule remained rare, but not unknown. The most celebrated medieval Muslim queen was Shajar al-Dur, who ruled Egypt briefly in 1250 after the death of her husband, the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih Ayyub, during the Seventh Crusade. Originally a Turkish slave who became her master's concubine and then wife, Shajar al-Dur kept her husband's death secret until the military crisis had passed, issuing orders in his name. When her husband's son from another marriage arrived to claim the throne, she initially surrendered power, but later supported a coup that restored her authority. She ruled in her own name for about 3 months, with coins minted bearing her title, Malikat al-Muslimin, Queen of the Muslims. Eventually, religious and political pressure forced her to marry a military commander who became sultan, though she continued to exercise significant influence. Shajar al-Durr's story reveals the constraints faced by female rulers in societies where religious law and custom strongly preferred male leadership. Even women of exceptional ability could only rule directly for brief periods before male authority reasserted itself, often through marriage alliances that gave women continued informal influence at the cost of formal authority. Similar patterns emerged in other Islamic societies. In 16th century Indonesia, the Sultanate of Aceh was ruled by 4 successive queens between 1641 and 1699. The first of these, Sultana Taj ul Alam, took power after her husband's death and ruled for 34 years. Under her leadership, Aceh reached the height of its commercial and cultural power, controlling much of the pepper trade in the region and developing a significant literary tradition. The religious scholar Nuruddin ar-Raniri initially supported female rule, writing a text that legitimized Sultana Taj ul Alam's reign through historical and theological arguments. However, later religious authorities challenged the succession of female rulers, and after the 4th Sultana was deposed in 1699, the ulama, religious scholars, of Aceh issued a fatwa prohibiting women from ruling in the future. The pattern of initial acceptance, followed by growing religious objection to female rule, appeared in multiple Islamic contexts. In India, the Delhi Sultanate briefly accepted the authority of Razia Sultana, daughter of Iltutmish, who ruled from 1236 to 1240. Trained in martial arts and administration, she dispensed with the veil, rode an elephant among her troops, and appointed officers based on merit rather than ethnic or tribal connections. These actions, while demonstrating her competence, also alienated powerful nobles who resented being governed by a woman who did not conform to gender norms. After a series of rebellions, Razia was forced to marry one of the rebel leaders in an attempt to legitimize her rule through a male connection. This compromise failed, and both were killed shortly afterward by yet another faction. The experiences of these Muslim queens highlight the additional religious dimension that complicated female rule in societies where political and religious authority were closely intertwined. Queens had to navigate not only practical politics, but also theological objections to their very existence as rulers. Some did so by emphasizing their roles as preservers of male dynastic lines, others by exceptional piety, and still others by military success that could be presented as divine favor. In Ethiopia, the legendary Queen of Sheba represents one of the earliest traditions of female rule in Africa, though historical details remain elusive. More concretely, the Empress Eleni of Ethiopia governed as regent in the late 15th and early 16th centuries after the death of Emperor Baida Mariam. A queen consort who had converted from Islam to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, she established diplomatic contacts with European powers and sent an ambassador to Portugal seeking alliance against Muslim states that threatened Ethiopia. Eleni's diplomatic initiative resulted in Portuguese military assistance that helped preserve Ethiopian independence during the invasion, led by Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. Though she did not rule in her own name, her regency lasted approximately 15 years and set the course for Ethiopian foreign policy for decades afterward. Her story demonstrates how queen regents could exercise substantial authority while maintaining the fiction that they were merely temporary caretakers for male heirs. In Northern Europe, Queen Margrethe I created the Kalmar Union in 1397, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, including Finland, under a single monarch. Born a Danish princess, she married the King of Norway and Sweden, and after his death and that of their son, she managed to have herself recognized as regent and then sovereign of all three kingdoms. Margrethe never took the title of queen, preferring to be called sovereign lady and husband of the realm, a linguistic choice that highlighted the unusual nature of her position. During her 28-year rule, she standardized laws, curbed the power of the nobility, improved trade, and created a stable union that would last over a century after her death. Her diplomatic skill enabled her to secure her position without major military conflicts, primarily through strategic alliances and careful political maneuvering. Sweden would later see another exceptional female ruler in Queen Christina, who ascended the throne in 1644 at age 18 after years of careful education directed by her father, the great military leader Gustavus Adolphus. Christina was raised as if she were a prince, trained in multiple languages, philosophy, religion, and politics. As queen, she attracted scholars like René Descartes to her court and positioned Sweden as a center of European culture. Christina's intellectual interests eventually brought her into conflict with Lutheran orthodoxy. In 1654, she abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome, where she established a salon that attracted artists and intellectuals. Her decision to prioritize intellectual and religious freedom over political power represents a unique path among the queens we have discussed, a voluntary surrender of authority in pursuit of personal autonomy. In Russia, beyond the 18th century empresses we discussed earlier, the 19th century saw the powerful influence of the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, mother of Tsars Alexander I and Nicholas I. Born a German princess, she married the future Tsar Paul I and bore him 10 children, ensuring the continuation of the Romanov dynasty. After her husband's assassination, Maria Feodorovna developed a complex relationship with her son Alexander, sometimes supporting and sometimes opposing his reforms. She maintained control over many charitable institutions and educational establishments for women, effectively creating her own sphere of influence separate from the formal structures of government. Her long life, she survived until 1828, gave her unusual continuity of influence across multiple reigns. The development of constitutional monarchies in the 19th and 20th centuries changed the nature of queenship, creating systems where queens regnate held symbolic rather than direct political power. Queen Victoria, whom we discussed earlier, straddled this transition, beginning her reign with significant political influence, but ending it as more of a constitutional figurehead, though still with considerable soft power through her relationships with prime ministers and foreign rulers. Her great-granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, who became Britain's longest reigning monarch, perfected the role of constitutional sovereign. Ascending to the throne in 1952 at the age of 25, Elizabeth presided over the final dissolution of the British Empire and its transformation into the Commonwealth of Nations. Though lacking formal political authority, she exercised significant influence through her weekly meetings with prime ministers, her role as head of state, and her position as a symbol of national continuity. Elizabeth's 70-year reign saw dramatic social, political, and technological changes, from the post-war austerity of the 1950s to the digital age of the 21st century. Through these transformations, she adapted the monarchy to changing expectations while maintaining core traditions. Her careful balancing of innovation and continuity helped the British monarchy survive when many other European royal houses fell to revolution or republicanism. The Queen's ability to remain politically neutral while still embodying national identity proved particularly valuable during crises like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Falklands War, and the coronavirus pandemic. Her Christmas broadcasts and occasional special addresses became rare moments when she spoke directly to the public, carefully choosing words that would unite rather than divide. Elizabeth's approach to queenship, dutiful, reserved, focused on institutional rather than personal power, contrasted with that of her glamorous daughter-in-law, Diana, Princess of Wales. Though never queen, Diana's impact on the monarchy and on public expectations of royal women was profound. Her use of media attention to highlight humanitarian causes, her emotional openness, and her complex relationship with royal tradition created new possibilities for female members of royal families to define their roles. The tension between Elizabeth's and Diana's approaches to royal womanhood highlighted a perennial question for queens throughout history: how to balance the personal and the political, the human and the symbolic dimensions of their roles. This balance has been negotiated differently across cultures and eras, but it remains a central challenge of female sovereignty. In countries where monarchs retain more direct political authority, contemporary queens face additional challenges. Queen Rania of Jordan, for instance, has used her position to advocate for education, cross-cultural dialogue, and women's rights while carefully respecting religious and cultural sensitivities. Her use of social media and international platforms to address global issues represents a thoroughly modern approach to queenship, yet one that builds on ancient traditions of royal patronage and diplomacy. Similarly, the queens of Thailand, Lesotho, Bhutan, and other countries with active monarchies today navigate between tradition and modernity, between ceremonial duties and informal influence. They often focus on social welfare, education, and cultural preservation, areas traditionally associated with female concern, but now understood as central to national development. The long history of queenship reveals certain patterns that transcend time and place. Successful queens have typically combined conformity to certain gender expectations, often around motherhood, piety, and cultural patronage, with selective transgressions that allowed them to exercise authority in traditionally male domains. They have built networks of support through kinship, patronage, and alliance, and they have skillfully used symbolic resources, from religious sanction to visual propaganda to public ritual, to legitimize their rule. At the same time, the specific challenges and opportunities facing queens have varied enormously depending on the legal, religious, and cultural frameworks of their societies. Some ruled through formal constitutional provisions that allowed female inheritance of sovereignty. Others exercised power through regencies, through male relatives, or through religious or cultural roles that gave them authority outside standard political structures. Still others created unprecedented positions for themselves, defining new possibilities for female leadership that neither fully accepted nor fully rejected existing gender norms. What unites these diverse experiences is the creative tension between gender and power, between what these societies expected of women and what they expected of rulers. In navigating this tension, queens throughout history developed leadership styles that sometimes differed significantly from those of kings. Many emphasized consensus building over confrontation, cultural patronage over military conquest, though as we've seen, plenty of queens led armies, and dynastic continuity over personal glory. These approaches were partly strategic adaptations to the constraints facing female rulers, but they also reflected genuine values and priorities. Queens often brought perspectives to governance that differed from those of male rulers, perspectives shaped by their experiences as mothers, as cultural mediators through marriage alliances, as outsiders to traditional male power networks, and as members of a gender whose socialization emphasized relationship building and emotional intelligence. Of course, these generalizations have many exceptions. Some queens were as militaristic as any king. Others were indifferent to the arts. Still others neglected family bonds in pursuit of power. The diversity of female rule reminds us that gender is just one factor shaping leadership styles, interacting with personality, culture, historical circumstance, and individual choice. As we reflect on these royal women across the centuries, we might wonder what relevance their stories have for us today. In societies where hereditary monarchy has largely given way to democratic governance, perhaps their most enduring legacy lies in the ways they expanded conceptions of female capability, creating precedents for women's leadership that extended beyond palace walls. When Hatshepsut commissioned great building projects, she demonstrated women's capacity for public vision. When Elizabeth I delivered her famous speech at Tilbury, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," she articulated a powerful claim about courage transcending gender. When Catherine the Great corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, she showed that intellectual engagement was not a male prerogative. These expansions of possibility rippled outward, influencing how societies understood women's capacities more broadly. Though the effects were often slow and uneven, each queen who successfully wielded authority made it slightly more conceivable that other women might do the same in different contexts. As rulers, certainly, but also as scholars, artists, reformers, and leaders of all kinds. At the same time, the history of queenship reminds us of the structural constraints that have limited women's access to formal power across most societies. The fact that female rule was often seen as exceptional, requiring special justification, or occurring only in the absence of viable male alternatives, reveals deep-seated assumptions about gender and authority that persist in modified forms today. Many queens throughout history understood these dynamics all too well. They recognized that their authority was often contingent, vulnerable to challenge in ways that male rulers' authority was not. This awareness led many to adopt defensive strategies, emphasizing their connections to male predecessors, downplaying their innovations as mere continuations of tradition, or sharing credit with male advisors to make their rule more palatable to contemporaries. Yet despite these constraints, queens found ways to leave lasting legacies. They built institutions that outlived them: hospitals, universities, legal codes, diplomatic alliances. They established precedents that future rulers, male and female, would follow. They commissioned art, architecture, and literature that preserved their visions long after their deaths. And they shaped historical memory through their own writings, through the records they chose to preserve, and through the stories they encouraged others to tell about them. As night deepens and sleep draws nearer, consider how these queens' stories have traveled across time to reach us here. Consider how they were recorded, transmitted, sometimes distorted, sometimes rediscovered. Consider how each generation has found different meanings in these royal lives, seeing in them reflections of their own questions about power, gender, duty, and personal fulfillment. In the silent hours, these queens keep their vigil. Hatshepsut in her temple at Deir el-Bahari, Eleanor crossing the Pyrenees in winter, Elizabeth watching the destruction of the Spanish Armada, Catherine riding through St. Petersburg to claim her throne, Nzinga negotiating with the Portuguese, Ya Asantewa rallying her people to battle. They move through the corridors of history, not as perfect heroines or simple villains, but as complex human beings who happen to wear crowns. Their voices speak across centuries, not in simple unison, but in complex harmony and occasional discord. They speak of ambition and sacrifice, of public duty and private longing, of the weight of decision and the solitude of ultimate responsibility. They speak of what it means to rule and what it means to be a woman in worlds that often saw these identities as contradictory. As you drift toward sleep, imagine these queens not in the formal portraits that presented their public faces, but in quieter moments. Imagine Isabella of Castile studying maps late into the night, weighing the risks and possibilities of Columbus's proposed voyage. Imagine Wu Zetian reading Buddhist texts, finding in them a philosophy that justified her unprecedented position. Imagine Queen Nzinga planning her next diplomatic move, balancing multiple threats with limited resources. These moments of reflection, of weighing options, of making decisions that would shape not just individual lives, but entire nations represent queenship at its most essential. Beyond the crowns and ceremonies, beyond the palaces and proclamations, rulership consists of these private acts of judgment, connecting immediate circumstances to larger principles, balancing competing values, and choosing paths forward in conditions of uncertainty. In these moments of decision, queens face the same fundamental challenges as kings, as all leaders throughout history: how to use power ethically, how to balance competing interests, how to pursue visions of the common good in the face of resistance and constraint. Their approaches to these challenges were shaped by their specific historical and cultural contexts, by their individual characters, and yes, by their experiences as women navigating male-dominated power structures. The resulting tapestry of female rule across history is rich with variation, from warrior queens like Boudica, who led the Iceni people against Roman occupation in first-century Britain, to diplomat queens like Theodelinda, who helped ease the conversion of the Lombards from Arianism to Catholicism in 6th century Italy. From reform-minded rulers like Maria Theresa to culturally influential consorts like Marie Antoinette. From queens who embraced conventional femininity to those who adopted masculine symbols and behaviors. From those who sought to transform their societies to those who worked to preserve tradition. Within this diversity, certain patterns emerge. Queens often excelled at forms of power that worked through relationship and influence rather than command. They frequently invested in cultural and religious institutions as sources of authority outside traditional male-dominated political and military structures. And they commonly used their positions as cultural mediators between dynasties, between countries, between traditions, as sources of unique insight and influence. These approaches were not inherently superior or inferior to the leadership styles more typical of kings, but they were different, shaped by the specific challenges and opportunities facing women who exercised sovereignty. In studying them, we gain insight not only into the particular women who wore crowns, but into the broader relationship between gender and power across human societies. As our journey through the lives of great queens draws to a close, and as sleep approaches on quiet feet, consider what these royal women might say to us now, across the centuries. Perhaps they would remind us that power takes many forms, not all of them marked by titles or fanfare. Perhaps they would suggest that leadership requires both courage and compassion, both vision and pragmatism. Perhaps they would observe that lasting influence often comes not from dramatic gestures, but from patient institution building, from cultural patronage, from the slow work of transforming values and expectations. Or perhaps they would simply tell their stories in all their complexity, allowing us to draw our own conclusions. For in the end, these queens were not abstractions or symbols, but human beings, facing circumstances both vastly different from and surprisingly similar to our own. They made choices with the information they had, guided by the values they held, constrained by the structures around them, enabled by the resources available to them. In their successes and failures, their wisdom and their blindness, they remind us of our own humanity, noble and flawed, aspiring and limited, caught between the worlds we inherit and the worlds we imagine. As you drift into sleep, let the stories of these remarkable women stay with you like distant music, like the soft glow of candles in a palace long ago. Let them remind you that history is not a simple march of progress, but a complex dance of change and continuity, and that women have always been part of that dance, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always present, always consequential. Let them remind you that power is never simply given, but must be claimed, shaped, and directed toward purpose. That authority can be wielded in many ways, not all of them obvious or dramatic. That leadership requires not just strength, but wisdom, not just decisiveness, but discernment, not just vision, but the practical skill to translate vision into reality. These queens ruled countries, but their deeper sovereignty lay in their refusal to be defined by others' expectations, their determination to shape their own stories even as they served larger causes. In this, they speak not just to those who wear literal crowns, but to all who seek to live with purpose and integrity in complex, sometimes hostile environments. As night deepens around you and consciousness begins to fade, imagine these queens passing the scepter of history from hand to hand, each adding her own distinctive mark before passing it along. The weight of it changes with each transfer, growing sometimes heavier with responsibility, sometimes lighter with shared wisdom. The jewels embedded in its surface catch the light differently as it moves through time and space, reflecting the diverse circumstances of female rule across continents and centuries. In this imagined procession of queens, there is no simple evolution from primitive to advanced forms of female leadership, no straight line of progress or decline. Instead, there is adaptation to changing conditions, innovation within constraints, the eternal dance between individual agency and structural limitation that characterizes all human endeavor. The story of queenship is not a separate thread from the broader tapestry of human governance, but an integral part of it, sometimes visible in bright colors on the surface, sometimes hidden in the supporting weave, but always essential to the overall pattern. By attending to this story, we enrich our understanding not just of women's history, but of political history more broadly, of how authority has been conceived, contested, and exercised across the human experience. As sleep begins to claim you, let these royal women recede gently into the distance, their crowns glinting faintly in the darkness like stars. Let their stories settle into your dreams, not as burdens of factual detail to be remembered, but as impressions of lives boldly lived, of power both claimed and surrendered, of the eternal tension between what we desire for ourselves and what we owe to others. The queens have returned to their kingdoms in the mists of time. The procession has passed, but its echoes remain, whispering to us across the centuries about the nature of power and the power of nature, about the dance of gender and authority, about the human capacity to transcend limitation without escaping contingency. These whispers follow us into sleep, into that realm where hierarchy dissolves and all crowns are laid aside, where queens and commoners alike surrender to the democracy of dreams. And so, we leave these royal women to their rest, knowing that they will rise again whenever their stories are told, whenever power and gender intertwine in ways that prompt us to look to the past for insight. They await us there, these queens of history, neither as perfect heroines nor as simple cautionary tales, but as complex human beings who wore the mantle of authority in their own distinctive ways. May their wisdom and their warning, their courage and their compromise, their public triumphs and private struggles accompany you into peaceful sleep. May their stories remind you that history is never closed, that the past speaks to the present in ever-changing voices, and that the dance of power continues, transformed but unbroken, across the generations. In the gentle darkness, the queens have spoken. Now it is time for silence, for rest, for the renewal that comes with night. The court has been dismissed. The chronicles have been closed. The royal seals have been affixed to the parchment of memory. Sleep now, and dream perhaps of kingdoms where wisdom rules, where power serves compassion, where the scepter passes from hand to hand in an unending chain of human aspiration and human limitation. Sleep, and let history watch over your dreams. Good night.